Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome back to Season 3 of the Logical Christian Podcast. I'm your Logical Christian, Dan Irwin. The Logical Christian Podcast is not here to tell you what to think. It's an exercise in how to think. Rather than just accept what we're being told with regard to current events, politics, science, religion, and everything else, we're going to stop the spin, ask questions, dive deep, and look at the world logically. And since logic is a gift from God, most importantly, we're going to look at it all as Christians. Links can be found in the show notes if you'd like to follow along. So with that, let's go be logical Christians. Going away can have different connotations depending on the context. If a loved one is moving a long distance, seeing them go away can be a very sad thing. If you're in the middle of a very uncomfortable situation, going away can bring immediate relief. If someone is bothering the snot out of you and for whatever reason they must go away, elation may be the emotion you feel. You get the idea. Sometimes going away is optional, sometimes it's mandatory, and sometimes it's not allowed, at least at that moment. On today's episode, first, we may have to go away later than we thought. In fact, it may be the last thing we ever do. And then we'll see who's going away for all the wrong reasons. And finally, I'm hoping you'll delay going away for just a bit longer as we delve deeper into our beliefs. So lace up those work boots and grab your lunch pail. Get ready for a much more masculine church setting, whether you want it or not. And finally, I suggest the subject line of your upcoming emails be something along the lines of, I disagree and here's why. Because here we go, but not away. Well, as I approach the ripe old age of 50 years, just a year and a half to go, after working ever since I was 16, my mind starts looking forward to retirement. Sure, I'm not the only one. Of course, I was looking forward to retirement 5 years ago, 20 years ago, pretty much ever since I started working and actually understood what retirement is. In fact, I'd retire today. Work can figure it out. That's not my problem. I'm ready to go. But here's the thing. I still require money. In this golden age of Bidenomics, I need more money than I ever have before. Thank you, President Potato. But the problem is exactly what people older than I, those nearly at or past retirement age, are finding out. There's too much life left over at the end of the money. In other words, we're no longer looking forward to retirement. We're desperately looking for retirement. We know that the Founding Fathers were careful to spell out this inalienable right in the Declaration of Independence. You know, life, liberty, retirement from labours, that's spelled Britishly with the U, and pursuit of happiness. I mean, you have to look really close. I mean, they used one of those little carrot, little up-pointing arrow thingies, and they tightly and lightly just kind of penciled it right in there. Pretty sure. I don't know. Look, just trust me on this. It's definitely in there. But now, found on notthebee.com, headline, the CEO of 401k giant BlackRock thinks the government should raise the age for retirement. So the CEO of BlackRock, Satan, sorry, I don't think that's how he pronounces it exactly. Let's see, Larry Fink, recently stated, quote, "No one should have to work longer than they want to, but I do think it's a bit crazy that our anchor idea for the right retirement age, 65 years old, originates from the time of the Ottoman Empire." Okay, we'll explore that shortly, but dude, I mean, seriously? I mean, come on. He is the CEO of an investment firm that controls over $10 trillion in investments, which includes many retirement funds. Larry Fink had his salary raised to $36 million per year in 2022. Of course, inflation has gone crazy, so I'm not sure how he could possibly scrape by on only $3 million per month. But honestly, I don't care what CEOs make. They can make as much as the market will pay them as long as they're managing their business correctly. And although BlackRock is an evil organization in general, and that's not hyperbole, he is managing a highly profitable, highly influential company. So good for him. I wouldn't want his job, even at his salary. I'll tell you what. So here's the problem. You boomers will all be 65 years old or more in 5 years, 2029. Then my generation starts retiring in 2030. Not me. I've got a ways to go, but the OG Gen Xers, they start dropping out of the workforce and start swarming the golf courses and fishing holes soon. Now, here's where I think Not the Bee gets it wrong, even though they're technically correct. They imply that Fink is worried that more people will be taking money out of his investment firm than will be contributing, and the author is correct that that will likely happen. But then he jumps to Biden signing a law in 2022 that forces all companies of 10 or more employees to automatically enroll all employees in a 401k plan, which BlackRock calls important progress. Now look, I agree that Fink and BlackRock are evil. I already said that. I also agree that nobody should be forced to contribute or save or plan or whatever. But knowing the vast majority of people would just squander any extra money, I'm kind of torn on the idea of forcing people into putting money away for retirement. There have been a number of times I've daydreamed about what I could do with the money that I'm putting into my 401k. And I'm nowhere close to maxing it out, that's for sure. But that money would be nice to have. But I'd waste it. Maybe on even worthwhile things. But as compared to being destitute in my later years, is a remodeled kitchen really a good investment? Now, Not the Bee continues their complaint, saying that Fink thinks, that's a little Dr. Seuss rhyme there, Fink thinks companies should provide matching funds, which I think is a great incentive for someone to save. And that anyone working any type of job, think of the gig economy, the Uber drivers, the delivery drivers, people like that, should be forced into this as well. And again, I'm kind of torn on this. Now, Fink was quoted as saying, quote, "Increasing lifespans create further difficulties when trying to improve the retirement system. This issue is of increasing relevance as blockbuster weight loss drugs have already begun drastically reshaping the healthcare landscape. As a result, it is worth taking a look at when Americans are expected to start accessing Social Security benefits, typically a sensitive topic that no politician wants to touch." He then mentioned a few potential solutions, including either raising the age for the start of retirement benefits or finding ways to encourage people to work later in life. And the article author ends his article with, quote, "I guess BlackRock would like us all to work ourselves into the grave." A little snarky, a little bitter, it appears, and we need to explore this as well. So, here's the thing. I have zero love for BlackRock or Larry Fink. Did I mention that they were evil? They're some of the biggest pushers of things like ESG scoring. That's environmental, social, and governance scoring. This is basically what China is doing now with essentially good citizen scores. If you say something you shouldn't or you don't toe the party line, then good luck, buying groceries or getting onto public transport. You're basically punished into submission. If you want to survive, do what you're told. Don't step out of line. This is what ESG is, and ESG is currently alive and well in hundreds of major companies and is the holy grail being pursued by the progressives in our government, on both the left and the right. If they have their way, you and I won't need to be canceled from Facebook or reprimanded at work or arrested for being a conservative, for all intents and purposes. No, our funds will just be frozen. Our ability to buy, sell, or move freely will be eliminated. ESG, without going into it, is, you'll never guess this, a very evil, fascistic form of tyrannical government. Thankfully, the word has gotten out and the pushback has been growing. The bad thing is that progressives never really go away. They just kind of slink back down to Hades for a time, rethink their goal, change some terms, and come back with the same thing, slightly repackaged. That said, as much as it pains me to say, Larry's not wrong about this one. So what exactly is retirement? Where did this concept come from? Why the age of 67 for the United States? And I guess it's 67 now, not 65. Doesn't really matter, though, as many people are working well past retirement age at this point. And why do other countries have it at different ages? The oldest, at least per data on worldpopulationreview.com, being 70 in Libya, and the youngest being 55 in Sri Lanka. So if you look up the history of retirement on the magical interwebs, what I found over and over again is the lament that people, they were expected to work until they died. This apparently went all the way back to the Stone Age, when most people worked all the way into their 20s, at which point most people died. Now, Let's just understand, that's an evolutionary, illogical, ridiculous notion. This article, found on nytimes.com, goes on to say, quote, even in biblical times, when a fair number of people made it into old age, retirement still had not been invented, and respect for old people remained high. In those days, it was customary to carry on until you dropped, regardless of your age group. When a patriarch could no longer farm, herd cattle, or pitch a tent, he opted for more specialized, less labor-intensive work, like prophesying and handing down commandments. Or he moved in with his kids. I like the crassy snarkiness. Very well done, New York Times. Most articles jump into the late 19th century rather than deal with evolutionary or biblical times or any time prior to what I would call modernish history. They'll give a passing mention that apparently in the Roman Empire, those who served as a legionnaire for 20 years would get some sort of a pension. They'll also give a passing mention to a few others, but then they jump to Chancellor Otto von Bismarck of Germany, who in 1883 announced that he would give a pension to anyone who was no longer working at the age of 65. This is apparently where the arbitrary age of 65 years old finds its genesis. The kicker is that not a lot of people lived all the way to 65 years old. This was meant for the very elderly at that time, likely with various disabilities absent modern medicine, right? According to this New York Times article, in 1905, the world-renowned physician, say it with me here, William Osler, classified man based on age. From ages 25 to 40, you were in your, quote, 15 golden years of plenty. He was speaking, of course, of your contribution to society through your employment, because that's really all that matters. From 40 to 60, you're tolerable. I'm tolerable. Some might argue that. Uncreative, kind of just there. That's what we are. And after 60 years old, well, you're quote, useless. You just needed to kind of move on down the road there. And this theory was soon applied to factory workers. Those old farts were just kind of pointless. They wouldn't leave. For some reason, they wanted money, to provide for the families and to use in order to live. But this was in the Industrial Revolution, and these old people with old brains and old bodies were just kind of gumming up the works a little bit. They were dropping things into equipment. They were breaking things and slowing things down and taking too long to perform tasks and taking too many personal days. And basically, they were sucking up jobs that the younger people could do faster and better. So, they figured out after the Great Depression exacerbated the problem that the best way to get those old, useless, barely humans to just go away was to pay them. The initial proposal was to make a mandatory retirement age of 60 years old and have the government pay them $200 a month, which was essentially a full-time salary for a middle-income worker. Well, President FDR wasn't as keen on the government paying that much for these people, and so he proposed the Social Security Act of 1935, which makes the worker pay into the system so they could later draw out of the system. Like a pyramid scheme, except way worse. The thought was that men would love to just be able to sleep in and then get up whenever and sit in their favorite chair, just relax in their twilight years. The problem was that men, by and large, they wanted to continue to work, so retirement had to be made more attractive. Well, in comes television, movies, the retirement community started to pop up, and an explosion of golf courses, and all of these helped to make the idea of just leisurely living out your last few years much more attractive to people. Adding other benefits like Medicare also helped to convince older people to retire, as well as lowering the age when one could retire and collect full benefits. The thought, even up into the 1980s, was that we needed to move these old people out of the way to make way for the younger people. Of course, now, with economies around the world failing and inflation growing and savings dwindling and less young people to fill spots and pyramid scheme retirement systems rapidly depleting and failing, countries are reversing course and raising retirement ages. That brings us to today, and the evil Mr. Fink is saying that we need to bump retirement age up. And this is where I say he's absolutely right. Let's go back again and start in Bible times. Not the Stone Age, as that's really a mostly made-up age based on evolutionary thought. Did men work until they died during Bible times? Yeah, they really did. I mean, they did. They worked until they couldn't work any longer. We could at least agree on that. I mean, at least in general. Whether that was death or their body was just simply broken down to a point they couldn't do it. I mean, think about it. There was a lot of very manual labor back then. You and I wouldn't make it more than, a few weeks doing what they did every day? I'm very convinced of that, and I would tap out way sooner than you, as the likelihood is relatively high that you're in much better shape than I. Retirement in the context we're discussing in the Bible is only mentioned in the Old Testament and only in relation to the Levite tabernacle priests. Numbers 8 tells us that the Levite males would serve from 25 to 50 years of age. At that age of 50, they were mandated by God to retire from service as a priest. And if you've ever read Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and didn't just, fly past all the very repetitive sacrifice verses, which we all pretty much do, you'll understand that the duties of the priests were very physically demanding. Coming up in one of my Let's Be Berean segments, or I don't know, maybe I've already done it, somewhere in a Let's Be Berean segment, I have given you an idea of what the festival sacrifices amounted to. Yes, I added them up by myself. And that's not to mention all the other sacrifices for, cleansing, for sins, etc. Let's just say that it was a lot. So those guys, after doing this for 25 years, were likely just worn slap out. That said, retire in the Old Testament usage was not sending them out to pasture. It wasn't putting them in their favorite chair or sending them off to play endless rounds of golf. The Hebrew word used for retire in Numbers 8 is spelled S-U-B with all sorts of little markings all over it and pronounced shuv. If you look at the general definitions of this word, it means to return or to turn back. And this is what we see in Numbers 8. After mandating retirement at 50, remember this was only for the priests, this didn't apply to anyone else, God went on to say, quote, "They may, however, minister to their brothers in the tent of meeting in order to keep up their responsibility, but they themselves shall perform no service. Thus you shall deal with the Levites concerning their responsibilities." See, they were not relieved of duty, only of the demanding service of the priest. They still had Levitical responsibilities, and they were still expected to perform them as long as they could. Interestingly, in the Bible, anytime we encounter an elderly person, and that age, of course, changed throughout the Bible fairly drastically, more often than not, we find that these old men would sit out at the city gate or something like that, and they weren't like, the McDonald's coffee club. They actually served specific purposes. They judged in matters of disagreements between people. They were witnesses to vows. They imparted wisdom and were requested to do so. They didn't just hit the lazy boy until they died. Nowhere in the Bible that I know of are we ever given the command or recommendation to retire at a certain age. If you speak to any pastor or elder worth his salt, he'll never tell you to retire. Now, sure, you may leave your career, but you're never to stop working for the kingdom of God. And I'd argue that as long as you're physically able, you shouldn't stop being physically active to whatever your ability. Don't just melt into the couch and drift into death. There's always something that needs to be done, or that can be done. I think of a dear woman from a previous church, my last church I was at, Miss Nancy. Oh, man. She's had so many medical issues over the last decade. There was a time or two when I was really legitimately concerned, and I think a lot of other people were too, that we were going to be losing her. But she fought and continues to fight, and although her body is nowhere near as able as it once used to be, her mind is sharp. And to whatever her ability, she'll die being of service to the kingdom. Of that I have no doubt. That's the biblical look, as far as I can tell. Never stop. Now, how many of us would, if allowed, be told by an angel, "Why are you standing there looking toward heaven? Jesus will come again one day, but we aren't to be standing around staring into the sky. We're to get to work." Now, back to Larry Fink's comments about raising the retirement age. So, Should people be made to work at their career until later in life? Is it right for us to not be able to access our full retirement until we're older? All right, consider this. When the Social Security Act was introduced in 1935, the average life expectancy in the United States was 60.7 years old. Just as Bismarck in the late 19th century Germany opted for giving a pension to those who were lucky enough to live beyond the life expectancy, that's what we were looking at in 1935 in the United States as well. As of 2020, the life expectancy stands at just under 79 years old. That's an 18-year increase in life expectancy. Now, I made the passing comment a few minutes ago that Social Security was nothing but a pyramid scheme, and that's exactly what it is. And so are company pensions, which is why most companies no longer have pensions, and those that did are in a constant process of buying pension holders out of their pensions. In fact, about the only place you'll find pensions these days are in unions. The problem is that Social Security and pensions rely on the same mechanism to stay solvent, enough people paying in to pay for those drawing out. And what we're dealing with right now is a massive number of boomers drawing out and nowhere near as many people paying in, or because of technology or automation, nowhere near as many people even needed in various employment areas paying in. Probably, a decade or so, Glenn Beck, I love him or hate him, did a segment on pensions, citing, if I remember correctly, the New York City Fire Department, something like that. The calculation was that it took 20 employed firefighters to pay for one retired firefighter. Now, the only way that fund stays solvent after only a few generations of firefighters is if the older firefighters died rather than retired. Now, the ratio isn't as bad, but I think for teachers in general, you're looking at like 3 to 5 teachers working for every one that's retired. And these pensions are already a handful of generations in, so how many more generations of teachers before you have an impossibly ridiculous number of teachers needed to pay for those retired, especially with life expectancy what it is today in relation to retirement age? Social Security and pensions were not meant for the majority. They were meant for the slim minority that somehow beat the odds and lived well past their expected average lifespan. When will Social Security run out? Depends on who you ask. If you ask any president, left or right, or most politicians, in fact, especially during election season, which never seems to end anymore, Social Security will never run out. We're fine. It's fine. Everything's fine. If you ask any honest economist, we're likely maybe 10 years or less before, we're going to need a massive government cash infusion. And that's the same with the pensions. The reason that the unions keep offering pensions is because they're pretty sure that when their fund goes belly up, which will be soon, the government, left or right, will step in with billions and trillions of dollars of cash to prop them up. And they're probably right. The retirement age was originally set to a point past where you were expected to die. And we've never, or almost never, really updated that number in nearly, 90 years? If we kept up with life expectancy, the retirement age would be about 83 years old right now. Seems a little high, as we have to look at life expectancy and probably physical and mental declination of abilities at various ages as well. But what I think is hard to argue is that thanks to modern medicine and replacement parts, etc., the life expectancy where we can reasonably be expected to have meaningful contributions has definitely increased since 1935. So what should retirement age be? Well, I think we'd be easily justified in raising it rather quickly to 72 years old, maybe even 75. Using the same gap as was in 1935, moving it to 72 or 75 would move us to about the 1960-ish range with regard to life expectancy. Like I said, there's a point where mental decline has to come into play, right? But 75 doesn't seem anywhere near as old as it once used to, and I don't think it's because I was a kid back then and now I'm much closer to 75 than I've ever been. If you want something fun, go on to your favorite web browsing searching engine and start looking up ages of people who played various roles on TV. Now, 30 or 40 years ago, much younger people than you'd expect played much older people because they looked much older. Now, some of you will not understand these references. Look them up. Remember the TV series Cheers? Now, that ran from 1982 to 1993. Remember the first few seasons it had the old bartender? I don't remember if he was the owner of the bar or whatever he was. Coach, right? That was actor Nicholas Colasanto. How old was he? He was 58 years old at the beginning of the series. He died in 1985, just a few years into the show run, at the age of 61. Would you have ever guessed that he was only 58 when that series started? How about the TV show Different Strokes? That ran from 1978 to 1986. Remember Mr. Drummond, the dad? Remember how old he was? When that series started in 1978, he was only 55. He wasn't even at retirement age by the time the series ended. Would you have ever guessed that? Or Edna Garrett, the housekeeper. Later, the lead role in Facts of Life. She was the red-headed, kind of always flustered, quavery-voiced woman. When Different Strokes started, she was only 52. And when Facts of Life started, only a year later, you probably already did the math, she was only 53. Would you have guessed that? One more. What about the Golden Girls? Remember? Betty White, Bea Arthur. Now, yes, look, I know. Makeup, wigs, etc. These things are used, but remember the mom, Sophia, the little old lady? She was supposed to be 80 years old. That's what she was playing. She was the mother of Bea Arthur, if I remember right. When that show started in 1985, she was 62. In fact, Bea Arthur, her television daughter, was 63, as was Betty White. And Blanche, the young, virile woman, was the ripe old age of 54. I would have to say that we are definitely aging differently these days. I don't think there's any way to deny that. So, with the increase in life expectancy, the longer lifespan of cognitive and physical abilities, the original purpose of Social Security and pensions, the failing pyramid schemes, the decreasing workforce, not to mention the lack of any biblical evidence for retirement, is Larry Fink of the evil BlackRock correct in suggesting an increase in retirement age? Yeah, not only is he right, to be honest, I don't see any other option. Now that said, whether they raise the retirement age, whether these doomed systems fail or not, whether your body is holding up or you've just worn it out, whether you retire early, on time, or like me, will likely work until you die, one thing we know for sure is that biblically, we are never to retire. If we can contribute physically, we do it. If we can contribute to God's kingdom through something less physical, like teaching or administration, leading a team, great, do it. We should all be striving to gain wisdom right now, biblical and practical wisdom, and we should be willing to help others to contribute what we've learned when called upon to do so. For the Christian, retirement, for as long as we're mentally and or physically able to work for the furtherance of God's kingdom, is simply never an option. Quote, "And the man said, 'The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave to me from the tree and I ate.' Then Yahweh God said to the woman, 'What is this you have done?'" And how many times has Yahweh God had to say to you women, "What is this you have done?" We, speaking for men everywhere, are completely innocent in this, and I can hear women the world over protesting right now. That's exactly what we'd expect. I mean, Shakespeare even knew it, as quoted from Hamlet, quote, "The lady doth protest too much, methinks." So why are women just in constant rebellion, you may ask? Well, they're a bunch of pagans. That's the problem. What, you think I'm wrong? Found on notthebee.com headline, "New poll reveals young women are abandoning churches in unprecedented numbers as young men are finally coming back." Then Yahweh God said to the woman, "What is this you have done?" Yeah, I joke. But in all seriousness, this is a problem. We've been seeing a growing number of people, and we're talking men and women here, all of the possible genders in existence, who consider themselves to now be nuns. N-O-N-E-S, meaning no religious affiliation, or those who consider themselves to be spiritual, but not religious, or people who claim to be ex-evangelicals, or those who are deconstructing their faith these days. Basically, on a holistic level, I would say for the last maybe, 10 years or so, at least from my perspective, we're seeing a widening of the gulf between legitimately born-again Christians and those who want nothing to do with it. Then hanging out in the middle of that gulf, I guess all packed onto a rickety rope bridge with boards missing and one of the ropes slowly unraveling and plinking away, are those I just mentioned. This is the be either cold or hot, right? The lukewarm thing ain't gonna work here. So let's see what's going on. Apparently, Gen Zer women are leading the way in leaving, per a new Survey Center on American Life poll. But not the bee is apparently more shocked by young men starting to outnumber young women in the church. The reason they find this more surprising is because for a number of decades now, men have had lower engagement than women with regard to religion. And yes, I think anyone, I'd say at least Gen X or older, maybe millennials even, know that generally speaking, women have been more involved in the church. They're running the nursery, they're teaching Sunday school, they're singing in the choir, they're running the teams, and the list goes on, including just simply attending Sunday morning services. So, to see the trend starting to reverse, well, for a number of reasons, I say that's exactly what we should expect to see. I mean, as I've maintained for a long time, everything is cyclical. It appears we may be just cycling back the other direction on this, but of course time will tell. Now let's jump to the actual survey and start looking at some of these statistics and then start talking about why we are and why we might be seeing this trend. So the bottom line of the survey is that when you look at the generations, baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, they all show that men have disaffiliated with religion at a somewhat greater clip than women. But the trend clearly shows that as the generations get younger, we approach parity, and now Gen Z adults show that women have finally overtaken men in this unfortunate stat. Baby boomers showed that 57% of those who left religion were men, and now Gen Z shows that 54% of those leaving are women, so an 11-point swing over 4 generations. And now we come to the kicker stat, if you will. This is the one that reveals the problem. Quote, nearly 2/3 of Gen Z women say churches do not treat men and women equally. And there you go. The problem is that women don't feel that they're equals in the church. And women shouldn't feel equality. Men and women are not equal. If you don't like that, talk to God. He's the one who set it up. We'll get to that. But the problem as I see it is twofold. One, women they expect to be equal because they've been told for decades running that they're the same as men, that they are equal, that they can do anything a man can do, and probably better because men are just kind of big stupids. And two, churches, specifically men in the churches, have abdicated their position of leadership in the church, and overall churches are capitulating to this demand for equality. So maybe that's 3 problems or 4, I don't know, but I'm calling it 2 problems because I'm the man here. Quote, even as rates of religious disaffiliation have risen, conservative churches have been able to hold on to their members, but they are facing more of an uphill battle keeping this current generation of young women in the pews. 61% of Gen Z women identify as feminist, far greater than women from previous generations. Younger women are more concerned about the unequal treatment of women in American society and are more suspicious of institutions that uphold traditional social arrangements. They go on to say that when compared in their respective age range, young women as compared to young men are more educated, more professionally ambitious, and more concerned with personal success and growth. Therefore, they've pushed faith and family farther down the list of priorities or expectations in life. In fact, they cite a recent Pew poll that found young men are now more likely than young women to desire a family, to aspire to be a parent. Now, this survey group does not appear to be faith-based or religious by design. In fact, they appear to strive to be neutral in their worldview. Nobody's really truly neutral. You can hear maybe not disdain, but at least critical skepticism from this site as they describe what they're calling conservative denominations. Quote, Many conservative denominations do not allow women to serve in leadership positions and offer little formal authority. The Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant denomination in the U.S., affirms an unambiguous gender hierarchy, requiring women to submit to male leadership. For girls and young women raised to believe that they can do anything men can do, this message is becoming more difficult to digest. Too bad? Really? What they're not understanding is that neither conservative denominations nor the Southern Baptists are making the rules here. Furthermore, they make it sound like it's just an oppressive regime. I know that Beth Moore, someone to mark and avoid, got her knickers in a twist because they wouldn't let her do whatever she wanted. I know that Rick Warren, another wolf, believes himself to be at least at the same level of authority as the Bible. Really, the Bible's only one book, and Warren has written, like a dozen or more, plus all the devotionals and study guides and all the other money grabs that go with it. So his authority is basically the same, if not way more than the Bible. Well, he got his knickers all twisted up as well, because the Southern Baptist Convention booted his pseudo-church for following his authority, not the Bible's. But look, Protestant Christianity isn't Christian Science or Jehovah's Witness or something where you can, check out any time you like, but you can never leave. If these horribly oppressed women don't like the iron boot on their necks, they can literally leave. In an AP article from 2019, basically excoriating every mainstream religion for their obsolete, patriarchal, misogynistic views, they quoted the SBC as saying that they are not anti-women. Quote, "However, because Scripture speaks specifically to the role of pastor, churches are under a moral imperative to be guided by that teaching rather than the shifting opinions of human cultures." But of course, the AP wasn't going to take that. They found a screeching Karen named Cheryl Summers, who was a former SBC member, who was, quote, challenging the church to improve its treatment of women, describing this gender doctrine as tortured logic, especially given the accomplishments of SBC women in the secular world. Summers vociferously protested via email, quote, "There's tremendous cognitive dissonance for a woman of faith who is leading professionally or through volunteer efforts when she experiences the glass ceiling and walls in her place of worship." So since women can bust through that glass ceiling in the secular workplace, the Bible needs to change. God needs to send down an update, I guess, one you can't refuse. You can delay it for a couple weeks and, then it'll just update whether you want it to or not. Overnight, probably. There are two possibilities that I can see here. One, there is a difference between the secular world of work and the God-ordained structure of church. Okay. Two, there should be no difference between the secular work world and the church world. And if the second one is correct, we have two possible solutions here. A, church needs to change to fit the ever-changing societal expectations and accepted norms. Of course, we need to decide how that looks as different countries and different cultures and different religions have different views for society. Or B, the world needs to realign itself with the biblical structure. And of course, this would be very interesting were it to be attempted. Talk about a civil war. So before we dive into that a bit deeper, let's do some stalking of Mrs. Cheryl Summers, shall we? And I say Mrs. because she's a stern, sturdy-looking woman married to a man who probably had all his hair prior to marriage, with two lovely daughters that are no doubt being taught non-biblical theological garbage by Mother Ma'am, while jello-spined hubby does as he's told. I will not link her Facebook page in the notes. Mrs. Summers is the, quote, founder and CEO at Leverage Broadband Strategies, some sort of networking company. On the team page, she, the CEO, is listed first, as she should be, with a large blurb all about her. That's fine. Then a man, I didn't physically spit when I said that, but I thought about it, who is a partner and board member. He gets a much shorter blurb about him. Then 4 more men, but only their pictures. No names, no blurbs. They're just men. So she's so empowered as a woman that she's built her leadership team out of all men. Okay, got it. She also organized the For Such a Time as This rally a few years ago when the big SBC abuse scandal was all the rage, and it sounds like she's advocating to some degree for the women and children who have experienced abuse at the hands of those who should have been protecting them and should be in prison. And in my personal opinion, if you're an abuser, you deserve a swift execution. Cleanse the camp. I know, it's not everyone's opinion. I just see no reason why someone who has literally destroyed at least some part of the lives of someone is deserving to keep theirs. So I don't know what she does with the organization anymore, but that's actually a good thing. That's good. That's very commendable of her. But that doesn't change the fact that she's nothing but a modern-day feminist and an anti-biblical egalitarian, which simply means she thinks men and women are equal in the church, which they're not by God's design. So here's the thing. Per her theory, which is the same theory that too many men and women in the church have today, the church needs to get with the times, man. Don't be such a square, daddy-o. But per the possible choices I just gave, using the Bible as my guide, which she's not doing, either we leave things the way they are, a well-defined male-headed system for the church, and just leave the secular world to do their own thing, or we demand the world follow the Bible's hierarchy, which means Mrs. Summers needs to hand the keys of the company over to her husband, who is probably wetting his pants right now, terrified of that possibility. But in no way should the church ever change with the culture. I mean, can you even imagine what a bastardized religious disaster we'd have if we had to keep opening up the canon of Scripture every time society changed their view on something? How many volumes would the Bible be at this point? For her to suggest that the times have changed and the church needs to keep up is proof positive why she doesn't need to be leading anything in the church. And yes, I'm probably going to be stepping deep in this topic in a minute, but again, I didn't make the rules. If you don't like what I've said thus far, and especially if you get a little smoked by what I'll be saying shortly, you're going to need to take it up with God. Don't be a Mrs. Summers. As I've told you before, don't just accept what I say about a topic or about anything biblical. Take it back to the Scriptures and test me. So this poll goes on to say that young women are growing more liberal, which I think we all know to be true, with more women siding with secularism pushed on things like abortion. Did you hear recently, I mean, this came out the other day, that like 61% of Catholics now believe abortion should be legal? Catholics! As for young women, the article states that 54% of young women in a poll from 2022 said that abortion should be available with no restrictions. If you start doing the math with the percentage of young women who profess to be Christian, Protestant or Catholic, adding it up to the 54% who believe abortion should be available with no restrictions, your number comes up over 100%, and that's not possible. Let me be very clear, and for some potentially very controversial. If you believe abortion should be legal, or is a right, or anything resembling those beliefs, you're either very, very naive and need to educate yourself before you speak or vote, or you're not saved. Potentially both of those things. Yes, I'm willing to make that judgment call. Abortion is murder, plain and simple. It's murder of a living child, an image bearer of God. You simply cannot be saved and be pro-baby murder. Now, you can try to prove me wrong if you like, but I'm not. You are. This article goes on to say that this increase in pro-death young women has also, oddly enough, coincided with the rise of the LGBTQIA2+ movement. They didn't use all the letters, I guess because they hate, with now nearly 30% of women under the age of 30 identifying as something in the alphabet mafia. 60% of young people who left the church cited the, quote, negative treatment of gay and lesbian people as a major reason they left. So first of all, 30% of young women are not LGBTQIA2+. If I were to guess, I'd say that it's actually in the 5 to 10% range, as it's historically been. The other 20 to 25% are bullied, pressured, or groomed into it, basically a victim of this social contagion, which means 20 to 25% of young women are going to be really, really pissed off soon, and we're starting to see it, and rightfully so. And now they're not just experimenting, they're mutilating themselves psychologically, internally, and externally, and nearly all of it irreversibly. And the anger, the rage that's going to absolutely engulf the 2 or 3 younger generations when they actually wake up and realize what's been done to them. Oh, it's going to be unlike anything we've ever seen. Mark my words. You can read the rest of the survey article or any of the other supporting documentation I've used. As always, links are in the notes. But what all of this comes down to is that baby murder, the poison alphabet soup, the demonic feminist movement, the currently accepted social norms, these are the big reasons as to why young women are leaving the church. And what's lost in all of this is male headship. Where is it? Dads, in many cases, have left the scene. Now look, I'm a divorced dad. I'm a divorced man. Yes, I have a teenage child. But despite the battles we've had, I haven't just thrown my hands up and given up. I haven't run away. I've thought about it, but I haven't run away. I've been fighting for her day in and day out, whether she wants me to or not. In many cases, dads are just gone. And then we have the dads that are there, but they're too busy fumbling with making sure their seams are straight so they don't look silly in their skirts, while the moms take charge. Statistically, moms are far more likely to push a child into the satanic gender confusion cult. But where are the fathers that should be blocking and tackling this garbage? The few that I've heard of are getting massively stifled by the courts, but at least they're fighting. Most of the dads that are still involved are just standing by while their children are being destroyed. God set man up as head of the church and head of the family for a reason. In Genesis 2, we see that God made man first, brought every kind of animal to him to be named, quote, but for Adam, there was not found a helper suitable for him. At this point, first surgery was performed by the great physician himself, extracting a rib and creating an entire person out of the rib, a woman person. Then he brought her to Adam. Eve was created as a helper for Adam, not second class, first class, in a different category. God did not create Adam and Eve to be equal. He created them both as image bearers of himself, neither more important than the other, but different, with different purposes. Then Genesis 3, we get the first inkling of the feminist movement. And make no mistake, the feminist movement is satanic in origin. Eve, who was supposed to look to Adam for guidance and protection, decided to strike out on her own and make a critical decision. Yes, based on deception, but this is still a decision that she is responsible for. But that's only one side of the feminist coin. The other side requires male headship to capitulate and cede leadership. In other words, it requires man to be weak, to disobey the mandate given by God. Adam, from the structure of the text, apparently was right there, either right in the vicinity or literally right there listening and watching it all. And he chose not to stop Eve, or chose not to bring this sin of Eve's to God. He chose to follow her lead, which is contrary to the created order. And regardless of Adam as our federal head ceding his leadership to his wife, he is unable to cede the responsibility he has to her. Adam was ultimately responsible for this failing. I can tell you that, again, as a divorced man, I am responsible for the failed marriage. That's not speaking as to how it came about, actions taken by either party, who's more to blame, blah, blah, blah. Ultimately, as the man, I am responsible for the failure of that marriage. I understand that. I accept that. Adam was ultimately responsible for the failure of his wife. Then in chapter 3, we see the curse of sin, pronounced on each party, of course. Specifically to Eve, God said, quote, your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Now, this is not speaking of her being all googly-eyed over her big old hunk of man. Remember, this was a curse. This is the struggle that we see today. This is the feminist movement. The woman will have the desire, the need to usurp the headship position of the man, counter to God's created order. And the man was tasked with keeping that created order in line, which necessarily means there will be strife and conflict between the sexes. And again, what do we see today? Twice in the New Testament, Paul makes it very clear that men are the head. He tells Timothy that he, quote, does not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet. And he tells the church at Corinth, quote, "The women are to keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but are to subject themselves, just as the law also says." Okay, I can sense you more liberated women bristling at this. So what does this actually mean? Well, there are some that completely ignore it, saying that it was a different time, it doesn't apply to today. That's a hard stance to back up, as there are many other aspects of those same letters that they would say does apply to today, and it was the same man who wrote it at the same time, in the same context, inspired by the same eternal Holy Spirit. That's a nonsensical anti-biblical stance. Others take it to the other extreme, that if you're a woman, when you get in the church, you cover your head, look at the ground, and shut up, unless you're spoken to, at which point you can peek out from behind your husband and quickly respond, then tuck back in and be quiet again. Well, that's not correct either. This is simply speaking of authority. First, this puts the burden on the man to literally be the spiritual head of the family. He is to be studied to the point that he can field and explain at least many, if not most, questions his wife and children may have about theological life issues. Man is quite literally mandated by God to be willing and able to mansplain. But second, this keeps the authority in the church. Remember, the Corinthian church was kind of an out-of-control thing going on there when Paul wrote this letter, which is why he wrote it. Timothy was very young and liable to be trampled over by those older than him. What this did is kept a woman from grabbing the mic, such as it was, and taking charge of the proceedings. This doesn't mean she can't ask questions or have input, but she is not to even approach the realm of teaching or taking charge. I can tell you from personal experience that one of the reasons that I left my last church was that after COVID and we started opening up again, they had one of the women of the church leading a multi-generational, multi-sex, whatever you want to call it, integrated, whatever, Sunday school class. And I sat in it once or twice. I had some issues with it, discussed it with the pastor, and it was ignored, and it shouldn't have been. But remember, this mandate where women are supposed to cede the headship to the man, it applies in relation to men. Women are absolutely supposed to teach and learn from each other and to teach children. But the men were set as the head of the church. Pastors are to be men. Elders are to be men. And no, unlike what some churches are trying to say, just because a woman is subject to the lead pastor who's a man, that doesn't allow her to take a lower pastoral role either. That's not a caveat that we've been given. All throughout the Bible, men lead. And again, that doesn't make them better, it makes them different. In fact, Christianity is the only religion, or non-religion, which is a religion of its own, that actually calls man and woman, slave and free, Jew and Gentile, equal in the eyes of God. Christianity is literally the only religion that respects women. But that doesn't make man and woman equal. It makes them both loved by God equally, but not given equal roles or responsibilities. And this doesn't have anything to do with ability. In fact, this has nothing to do with salvation, as the woman, by being submissive, by being faithful to her unsaved husband and to God, has a good chance of winning his soul for Christ by being who God designed her to be. Weird how by following God's design, good things can happen, even in a fallen world. In fact, in the Bible, when you see a woman assume a leadership position, think of Deborah, the judge in the book of Judges. It's a commentary or a judgment on the abject failure of weak men. Deborah was placed in a leadership position in ancient Jewish society, which had to be a slap in the face to the Israelite men. But, quote, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. It was a society of chaos, of weak men, of weak leaders, of people driven by their own lusts and desires. Deborah was a judgment on the Jewish people. Fast forward to today, the feminist movement has destroyed society, and weak men have let it happen. The issues we see today, no-fault divorce, abortion, the alphabet mafia, the mutilation of our children, polyamory, polygamy, the queering of our churches and denominations, they're all born out of feminism. But don't forget the other side of the coin, born out of feminism because of the weakness of men, the lack of a spine to stand up and say, hey, this far, but no farther. And I say it like that because I would in no way advocate for going back to a time when women, say, couldn't drive or couldn't vote, couldn't work or anything like that. I honestly don't know where to draw the line, but I do believe that women should have their inalienable rights and they shouldn't be second-class citizens. I can tell you this, though, I can't see me ever voting for a woman as president. Well, I mean, in our current system, if I had no other choice, I guess I'd be forced to. But that's how I feel about Trump this time around, too. Lesser of two evils. But I don't think a woman should be president. I just don't. Because I don't think they were created to take that kind of a role. Despite a couple of women leaders, like Margaret Thatcher, for instance, who was fantastic at it. A handful of years ago, I would have said probably the opposite of that. But I've watched now a number of women senators, governors, etc. just blast off like a firework with the greatest resolve, the greatest message, rock-solid morals and values, only to explode and come fizzling back down to earth in pretty short order. And when women in those positions fail, they fail hard and fast. Now, men can also do this. Yes, I agree. But we were created to be the head. It doesn't change that. We were created to take charge, to lead, and to bear that responsibility. Again, where do I draw the line for women running companies, managing workforces, etc.? I don't know. I've seen good. I've seen very bad. I work for a woman. My boss is a woman, and she's fantastic at it, and I wouldn't want her job because I don't want to work those hours or deal with the people she deals with. In my opinion, work is just that. It's work. It's a paycheck. I go in, I put in my time, do my best to contribute, knowing that I represent Christ, so I better work with that knowledge, and then I go home. Women in leadership positions in a business, it's just not a thing I care about. Back at home, men have been mandated by God to be the head. It doesn't mean he'll do it well, but a man who is leading will do everything he can do to lead like Christ. This does not mean demanding submission. This means loving, guiding, leading in and with wisdom. If a man strives to live and lead like Christ, regardless of how much will fail, how could a woman not want to submit and fulfill her God-given role as well? And Genesis 3 tells us that. The curse didn't have anything to do with how well or poorly the man leads. The woman will, because of her sin nature, desire to take control. And just like with all other sins, she must fight that urge to usurp. And from my personal experience, women struggle as much with doing that as men struggle with leading like Christ. Sin nature is a booger. Well, I could go on for hours about the evils of the feminist movement, the sinfulness of it, the secting of roles, and so on and so on. But the bottom line, why are young women leaving the church? Well, because the curse of sin drives the feminist movement, of which the sole purpose is to do away with men and flip God's created design on its head. So what do we do about this? Well, putting the genie back in the bottle may be impossible on this side of glory. But the positive thing is the other side of the survey, right? The apparent shifting of young men back into the church. Now, we can only hope and pray it's to the right churches, not these charlatan wolf dens, but the shift is at least statistically noticeable in the right direction. The solution is for strong men, strong, spiritual, born-again Christian men to step up and to start to fulfill their God-given mandate. Lead in the church, lead in the family. This is done not through brute force, but through wisdom, love, compassion, knowledge, and gentleness. We must strive to live, love, and lead like Christ, and not bow to the demands of the world. We saw some of this during the COVID era, with some pastors refusing to obey man rather than God. That's a great first step. But this won't be easy, and likely it will be generational again. But men, women need us, even single old men like myself, to lead this world. We need to be strong, we need to be resolved in what we know to be true, and not compromise because it's easier. We need to stand firm in the truth, which is getting harder to do these days, regardless of the consequences. Women and future generations require us to do this. God mandates that we do this. And as history has shown us time and time again, failure to do so will result in a devastating collapse of spirituality and society. Women, give us room to try and to fail. Your handling of the family, your interaction with your husband, your submission, your leadership, your love and grace are as vitally important as men leading. God set up our complementary society like he did for a reason. He didn't make a mistake, he didn't misunderstand, and he never rescinded his created order. Humans just didn't like it, and we decided to do it our own way. And it's never worked, and it never will. We must get back to knowledgeable, scriptural, role purity once again, and we must get on our knees and repent for where we have failed to follow God's commands. Our core question: do you know what you believe and why? Now, there are only 4 possible answers to that question. The worst answer, but if you're being honest, probably the best answer: I don't know what I believe, and I have no idea why I think what I do. The lazy and most dangerous answer is typically, I don't know what I believe, and I know why I don't know. The only possible reason, of course, being that I just don't care, or whatever. It'll all work itself out in the end. The answer that most, if not maybe nearly all of us fall into at varying degrees: I know what I believe, somewhat, but I don't know why. Or at least there are aspects of what I think I believe, and I'm really not sure why, or I've never thought about why. I've just always believed it. And you can see there's a wide range of possibilities in this answer. And then the answer that we probably generally speaking can't attain, but we should be striving toward: I absolutely know what I believe, and I know why, no question whatsoever. After Christ comes back, we'll all be able to say this. As for now, And that's what we're doing here, though. We're working toward that 4th answer. Welcome back to Lesson 3 in our look at the Heidelberg Catechism. In the last lesson, we covered the first question of the intro to the Heidelberg. It was a big question, had a lot of references, took the full lesson, but hopefully it was helpful. As I said that last lesson, most of the questions aren't anywhere near that large. There are a few, but most are much shorter, far fewer biblical references, because the point of a catechism is to break down what we believe into small bite-sized pieces so we can digest them little by little and come out with a much better idea of what we believe and a solid biblical background as to why. Almost seems like Senior Heidelberg was working on, do you know what you believe and why, right? Okay, anyway, let's pick up where we left off. Now, I don't plan on doing this normally, but I'm going to just read the first question and answer, not go into anything with it, but just read it because the second question references it. So question 1, what is your only comfort in life and in death? Answer: that I am not my own, but belong, body and soul, in life and in death, to my faithful Savior, Jesus Christ. He has paid for all my sins with his precious blood, and has set me free from the tyranny of the devil. He also watches over me in such a way that not a hair can fall from my head without the will of my Father in heaven. In fact, all things must work together for my salvation. Because I belong to him, Christ, by his Holy Spirit, assures me of eternal life and makes me wholeheartedly willing and ready from now on to live for him. Okay, so that is the core of our belief as Christians. So moving on now, question 2, what must you know to live and die in the joy of this comfort? Answer: 3 things. First, how great my sin and misery are. Second, how I am set free from all my sins and misery. Third, how I am to thank God for such deliverance. The answer to this question is how the rest of the Heidelberg is broken down into these 3 categories. But let's look at their scriptural backing for this answer. Let's look at the why, and we'll go on from there. First, how great my sin and misery are. Romans 3:9 and 10, quote, what then? Are we better? Not at all, for we have already charged that both Jews and Greeks are all under sin, as it is written, there is none righteous, not even one. So as Paul is writing to the Jewish and Gentile Christians in Rome, chapter 3 starts with Paul asking, what advantage is it to be a Jew? And this is a question Paul anticipates because in chapter 2, he was discussing the Jewish law, specifically the law of circumcision, and how these laws and rules and traditions now only serve to condemn, not to save. So the Jewish believer would then look at their entire history and wonder, what's the point of it all then? Paul goes on to answer that being a Jew is very important. The Jewish people were entrusted with the oracles of God. But when it comes to our sin, our lostness, our need for a Savior, there is no better or worse. And continuing on, Paul, quoting from various Psalms, and in one location in Isaiah, says, quote, "There is none righteous, not even one. There is none who understands. There is none who seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. There is none who does good. There is not even one. Their throat is an open tomb. With their tongues they keep deceiving. The poison of asps is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their paths, and the path of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes." This is speaking of you and me, not just the person or people group you thought of when I read that. Remember, quote, "There is none righteous, not even one. There is none who seeks for God." Now, this is quite literally the Calvinist position. We are incapable of seeking for God. We don't want to. We have no interest in God. He's the oppressor, if you will. At least that's what we think and believe before God acts on us first. Now, the Arminian position, which I'd guess most of you are, says that, this is true, but we were created with a little bit of goodness still, just a spark called a prevenient grace, that we may or may not choose to use that grace to come to faith in Jesus. Now, that idea it's a neat idea, except for the fact that it's not taught anywhere in the Bible, and it makes man the arbiter of salvation, placing Jesus in a position of begging, pleading, weeping, hoping that people will choose him. Again, this is found nowhere in the Bible. Our sin and misery, and thus our inclination, our destiny is complete and set apart from God rescuing us of his choosing. But we'll get into that later. Back to the answer. A second reference for the first part is 1 John 1:10, which says, quote, "If we say that we have not sinned, we make him a liar, and his word is not in us." I think we've probably covered this. The next part, quote, "Second, how I am set free from all my sins and misery." Okay, we've got a few texts here. John 17:3. Now, this is dropping into the middle of the high priestly prayer of Jesus just prior to his arrest, as he just mentioned that God has given him authority over all flesh and all of those whom the Father has given the Son, quote, "And this is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent." Jesus, salvation through Jesus, is our only hope. Acts 4:12, after Peter and John were arrested and placed in front of the rulers and elders and scribes, as well as Annas and Caiaphas, being questioned as to who exactly they thought they were, spreading this salvation through Jesus rumor thing. As part of their answer, they said, quote, "And there is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven that has been given among men by which we must be saved." Then later in Acts 10, Peter, in front of the Gentiles, says, quote, "Of him all the prophets bear witness that through his name everyone who believes in him receives forgiveness of sins." Now this is crucial. All the prophets spoke of Jesus. Centuries or millennia before Jesus was born, they spoke of him. It almost seems like someone is in control of all of this. Okay. Third part, quote, "Third, how am I to thank God for such deliverance?" Now, what do we do because of how wretched we are now that God has rescued us? Well, as salvation is not the destination, but the start of the journey, we have a number of responsibilities at this point. Matthew 5:16, quote, "Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." Right? No hiding this under a bushel basket. No, we gotta let it shine. Romans 6:13, quote, "And do not go on presenting your members to sin as instruments of unrighteousness, but present yourselves to God as those alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness to God." We don't need to clean ourselves up before being saved, but we need to be working on cleaning ourselves up after salvation. This is the process of sanctification, which is impossible apart from Jesus. Ephesians 5:8-10, quote, "For you were formerly darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. For the fruit of that light consists in all goodness and righteousness and truth, trying to learn what is pleasing to the Lord." Then we have 2 Timothy 2:15. Come on, you Awana grads. Say it with me, in the KJV, of course. Quote, "Study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth." Study. If you're not reading, your Bible or other materials, getting to church, actually paying attention in church, listening to solid theological sources, you're not doing what you're called to do. Work. We're told to work. Be ready to give a solid biblical answer to anyone who asks where our hope comes from. And then 1 Peter 2:9-10, quote, "But you are a chosen family, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of the darkness into his marvelous light. For you once were not a people, but now you are the people of God. You had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy." We're heralds, right? We're proclaiming truth into a dark world because God has chosen to save us. Again, once we're saved, we have work to do. Okay, so that's the intro questions, just those first two questions. That's the intro, which means that we now move into the first section, which is an extensive discussion of our misery, right? Our unsaved lives, our slavery to sin, sentenced to the second death. Now, I'd guess that if you're listening to this, you're likely saved already. And if that's the case, don't tune out. This is important. If we want to know the why for our belief, we need to understand who we were. Now, if you're not saved, this is who you are. This is where you are. This is where you live right now. This will take a number of lessons to get through, but let's get a start. Question 3. How do you come to know your misery? So I want you to think about this before we go to the answer. Someone born into slavery, someone born in a gulag or a prison, they have no idea they're there unless someone or something enlightens them as to their condition compared to either others or what their life could be. Right? So the answer, the law of God tells me. That's pretty simple, right? So we go to Romans 3:20. Quote, "Because by the works of the law no flesh will be justified in his sight, for through the law comes the knowledge of sin." This is why witnessing to someone with a good life, the average guy who's got a wife and a couple kids and he's got a decent job and he's making ends meet and a little extra money and stuff, he's got a good life, but he's not saved. Witnessing to that person and telling that person how being saved will make their life good is, well, first of all, not true. Nothing in the Bible says that salvation will give you a good life. In fact, it says pretty much the opposite. But second, that reasoning never gets anywhere. It can't hit home. This person's life is fine. They don't need that Jesus. The law, think the 10 Commandments, when you show a person with a good life that they're nothing but a lying, murderous, thieving, blaspheming, covetous adulterer at heart, that's what places all men, rich, poor, male, female, white, black, on a level playing field. This is what I've said before, and I know some people think that I shouldn't say it this way, but I like to say it this way. You have to put people into hell in order to help rescue them out, right? So, you basically, you tell people, that person you absolutely despise? Yeah, your ultimate destination is the exact same as that person. You're not better. He's not worse from an eternal standpoint. See, we're all stuck. We're all condemned, for the Bible tells us so. Romans 7:7-25. This is a larger section. Quote, "What shall we say then? Is the law sin? May it never be. Rather, I would not have come to know sin except through the law, for I would not have known about coveting if the law had not said, 'You shall not covet.' But sin, taking opportunity through the commandment, worked out in me coveting of every kind. For apart from the law, sin is dead. Now I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin revived, and I died. And this commandment, which was to lead to life, was found to lead to death for me. For sin, taking an opportunity through the commandment, deceived me, and through it killed me. So the law is holy, and the commandment is holy, and righteous, and good. Therefore, did that which is good become a cause of death for me? Well, may it never be. Rather, it was sin, in order that it might be shown to be sin by working out my death through that which is good, so that through the commandment sin would become utterly sinful. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am fleshly, having been sold into bondage under sin. For what I am working out I do not understand, for I am not practicing what I would like to do, but I am doing the very thing I hate. But if I do the very thing I do not want, I agree with the law that it is good. So now, no longer am I the one working it out, but sin which dwells in me. For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is, in my flesh, for the willing is present in me, but the working out of the good is not. For the good that I want, I do not do, but I practice the very evil that I do not want. But if I am doing the very thing I do not want, I am no longer the one working it out, but sin which dwells in me. I find then the principle that in me evil is present, in me who wants to do good. For I joyfully concur with the law of God in the inner man, but I see a different law in my members, waging war against the law of my mind and making me a captive to the law of sin which is in my members. Wretched man that I am! Who will deliver me from the body of this death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then on one hand, I myself with my mind am serving the law of God, but on the other with my flesh, the law of sin. I have nothing to add. Paul is very good and very thorough, isn't he? Moving on. Question number 4. What does God's law require of us? Answer. Christ teaches us this in summary in Matthew 22:37 through 40. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. And this comes from 2 locations. Deuteronomy 6:5, quote, you shall love Yahweh your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And Leviticus 19:18, quote, you shall not take vengeance, and you shall not keep your anger against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am Yahweh. It's almost like Jesus knew the Old Testament and felt that it was important. It's almost like that, right? Interesting. Okay, we better stop. So, our comfort in life, speaking to those who are saved, is that we're not our own. We belong to Jesus Christ, bought and paid for, no givebacks, no repossession, no abandonment. And to be a Christian, we must understand who we were, how to get away from that life of slavery to sin, and then how to thank our rescuer and do what he asks of us. We also learned that the law of God reveals our sin to us, and the law, when broken down, requires us to do 2 impossible things: love God and love our neighbors. At least these are impossible to do perfectly and correctly. Now, I hate to leave you in such an unenviable, tenuous position, but our time is gone. Thankfully, God doesn't work on the timing of a podcast, right? His timing is perfect, and he'll never leave his children, past, present, or future, in a helpless position. And given time, we'll make our way through all of this in the Heidelberg Catechism. So, until we meet again, go forth and strive to know what you believe and why. And with that, sadly, we've reached the end of yet another episode of the Logical Christian Podcast. I feel we've bonded as we've laughed and cried and twisted our faces in incredulity. If you've enjoyed or found value in what you've heard, go on and do all the podcast things. And don't forget to check the show notes for links and contact info. Lawrence J. Peter said, against logic there is no armor like ignorance. Jesus told us that if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So stay in the word, stay logical, stay faithful, and until next time, God bless.